It's Not a Boy, Chapter 2, Sunnyside. It was a long time before I had something else to put on my what I'm good at list, and I got it at Sunnyside. When Mam could spare the time from working on the farm, she took me on the bus to Sunnyside, which was an old house in Ringham. It had stood forever and never changed. Mam went to see her sister, Auntie Peggy, who lived there with the Great Aunties. And Mam always sat in the kitchen and drank tea, and they talked a lot, mostly about a man called Henry. All I had to do was keep out of sight of the Great Aunties, those Auntie Dolly and Auntie Dilly. I was a bit scared of them both. Auntie Dolly because she was so strict, and Auntie Dilly because she was deaf and dumb. I wasn't scared of Auntie Peggy though. Auntie Peggy was a very interesting person. For a start, she worked on the teleprinter in the war and passed secret messages on to somebody who could break the code and find out what the enemy was doing. I wished I could be good at cracking codes. As you know, I decided to be good at quite a lot of things, but I only had one thing on my list so far, and I needed lots more things so that I could grow up in the world and do well and make my mum and dad proud of me. I sat thinking about being good at things and watched Auntie Peggy blow smoke rings into the air. I didn't know any other lady that smoked. I told you she was interesting. My dad smoked. He smoked a pipe, but most men smoked a pipe. No ladies smoked, except Auntie Peggy. I used to watch as she threw the smoke into the air in big, big rings, and then she stubbed out her cigarette on the little brass ashtray, which was an ivy leaf, on the mantelpiece, and there was a little wren on the ivy leaf, a little brass wren, and it seemed to raise its eyebrows in disapproval at Auntie Peggy smoking, and so did Great Auntie Dolly. I was scared of Great Auntie Dolly, as I've said, because she was strict. Auntie Peggy didn't seem worried about her strictness now. Mind you, Mam told me that once long ago she was frightened of her, just as I was. Mam told me a story, and I think it's a very sad story. When Auntie Peggy was born, her home was crowded with young brothers and sisters, but Auntie Dolly and Auntie Dilly had no children, and they had plenty of room at Sunnyside. So it was decided that Peggy should go and be their daughter, and they could be her mother. I suppose it was nice for them because they didn't have any children and they were lonely without them. They were just on their own. And it would be nice for little Peggy because she would be an only child. And that was how it was. Just the three of them at Sunnyside. And then war broke out, and Peggy was a young woman by then, and she went to do war work in an office. She walked through the gate at Sunnyside with her little brown suitcase tightly buckled and went down Green Lane to a secret place down south. Young Peggy loved her interesting work and passed secret messages from the enemy to a man called Henry, who was very good at cracking codes and finding out what the enemy was trying to do. Auntie Peggy fell madly in love with Henry, and he fell in love with her. And when the war was won, they would surely marry, I thought, and live together forever and ever. And so naturally, one day, Peggy brought Henry to Ringham. They walked arm in arm and in love down Green Lane and through the gate at Sunnyside. Then Henry went down on one knee in the garden, where the big poppies brushed the bright floppy petals all over his trousers. He was proposing to Auntie Peggy. Of course she said yes, straight away, because she loved him. He was quite a bit older than her, but that wasn't a problem. And my mum said that he was probably a bit of a father figure for her, as she'd been brought up with a lot of women. When Henry had got his answer from young Peggy, he went straight to Auntie Dolly, who was sitting bolt upright in her chair, and he told her that he wanted to marry Peggy and live with her forever and ever, and they wanted to be together. They never wanted to be parted, and so he asked for her hand in marriage. "No!" shouted Auntie Dolly. "No, no, that would never do." How could he? What was wrong? Marrying a man much older was a bit unusual, but it was no real problem for them. Well, no, that wasn't the problem. There was another problem, a big problem, and that was that Henry had been married before. He was a divorced man. Auntie Dolly would not allow him another wedding, and as I've told you, she was very strict, and her word was law at Sunnyside. To be divorced was a disgrace, and it was against all Dolly's strict Methodist upbringing. He could not marry Peggy, and that was the end of that. When young Peggy heard the news, she ran out into the garden crying, and Henry ran after her, and he put his arms round her, but it was no good. She shrugged him off. She was scared of Auntie Dolly. And after a lot of crying and sitting in the garden with the poppy petals falling on her shoes, she said goodbye to Henry. And the beloved Henry, with his eyes full of tears, went off down Green Lane. And that was the end of Mum's story to me, and I thought that it was even sadder, because Auntie Peggy never married anyone. Henry was her one true love. She was often sad and didn't laugh much, and she got a bit hardened after the war, and she started in the end to not do as much as Auntie Dolly told her, and she stood up a bit to Auntie Dolly. When the war was finally over, Peggy dutifully came back to Sunnyside and went to work in Hull. I found that very interesting, because I only went to Hull when I had to go for my hospital check to see how my poisoning was getting on. It was getting on quite well, but my mum and me had to go every month into Hull. I was susceptible to illness, my mum said, and I was quite small for my age. I didn't like going to Hull at all. It was all bombed out, and we had to pick our way through the rubble of bricks and mortar, and that was where Auntie Peggy went every day, leaving her aunties at Sunnyside, where they passed the day in the garden if the weather was fine. The Great Aunties wore wide-rimmed, bright-coloured sun hats, and they looked just like their nodding poppies in the garden. Great Auntie Dolly would dig a hole for a plant and firm it in on one side of their path, and then Great Auntie Dilly would come along, dig it up, and put it on the other side of the path. For some reason, Dilly was not frightened of Dolly, and Dolly did not say, "No, no, that would never do," to Auntie Dilly. And their plants grew and grew, and flowered, and their fruit and vegetables dripped over, and they fell into your hands as you went past. Even their little bantam hens at the bottom of the garden laid hundreds of eggs. The Great Auntie's breakfast was eggs every day. cooked Sunnyside down for Dolly and Sunnyside up for Dilly. And every day Dolly fed the hens with corn and Dilly gave them water. So their garden was always full to bursting, with things to look at and things to eat. Sometimes the great aunties would be in the kitchen cooking things they had grown. Great Auntie Dilly turned the cooker to hot, and then Great Auntie Dolly heaved herself up and turned the cooker down to cool. But it didn't matter. Their food was always cooked to delicious perfection. Mostly, though, the great aunties were sitting together in the front room having cups of tea while the little wren watched from its perch on the mantelpiece. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, just as they always had and always would. As I have said, I was scared of Great Auntie Dilly as well, not because she was strict, but because Dad said she was deaf and dumb. She was very thin. Well, to tell the truth, she was skinny. And she was so skinny that I couldn't see how her innards fitted inside her. Come to think of it, she was more skinny than me, which is saying something. Her head was big for her little body, and her face looked funny with smooth cheeks caved in because she hardly had any teeth. But the worst thing of all for me was that because she could not say proper words, I couldn't tell what she was saying. You see, even though Dad said she was dumb, it was not quite true that she couldn't talk. What he meant was that she couldn't talk how we talked. She used to talk in her own way. When she said something to me, it sounded like ga, gee. And I couldn't crack the code to find out what she was saying. Words came out through her nose and got mixed up with the air coming in. Auntie Peggy understood her, of course. I expect Henry had taught her a bit about cracking codes in the war, but I could just not understand what she was saying, and that was scary for me. Gee, ga, gee. She shouted louder and louder, and I must hear her, how scary she was. I just had to make sure she never got the chance to talk to me. I had to keep out of her way, so there we were. I had to keep away from both of my great aunties, Dilly because she was deaf and dumb, and Dolly because she was so strict. And it was strange, because even though they were all together, you probably know by now they were the exact opposites. Dolly looked very different from Great Auntie Dilly. When Dolly walked, she was slow and deliberate, and when she sat down, she filled the chair with a big body. Her hairy cheeks bulged out, and her sausage fingers were sparkling with rings. She wasn't deaf like Dilly either. Her hearing was so good, she heard everything and saw everything. Well, that's not quite true, because she didn't hear or see me sneak upstairs, which I often did at Sunnyside. I dashed past the front room and tiptoed up the wooden stairs, because if she had seen me, she would have shouted, "No, no, no, that would never do." I just had to be very careful that I was never found. One day I sneaked upstairs at Sunnyside, and Mam and Peggy were talking about men again in the kitchen, and Great Auntie Dolly and Great Auntie Dilly were sitting in their chairs in the front room. I was really careful and didn't make a sound as I went up the stairs unnoticed. Up and up I went, onto the corridor that seemed to go on forever, until the end, where there was a little brown suitcase. I'd seen it before, but this time I wanted to look inside. I undid the buckles and carefully put my hand inside. I could smell the hidden mysteries of long ago. I felt something soft, I pulled it out carefully as best I could and had a look in the dim light. It was a little black velvet purse embroidered with bright poppies. I held it to my face and felt its powder puff softness. I ran my fingers along the shiny petals, and it was then that I felt something else inside. I knew that opening a purse was a dreadful thing, but I could not resist it. I lifted the flap and then turned round guiltily, because I knew what I was doing was unforgivable. You should not go in anybody's purse. I tipped the purse and out rolled a farthing with a little brown wren on one side at the top. There was a little ring fastened to it, so it could go on a chain if you had one. Creak! What was that? What was that? I was sure I heard a noise, and I peered into the gloomy passage, but I couldn't see anything. So I felt again in the purse, and I pulled out an old photograph of a handsome man in uniform.